Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'as fait manquer. Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée. Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello and welcome to Bruxelles, je t'aime, Euronews' talk show all about the European capital of Brussels. On Brussels, my love, we break down the big stories of the week, examine what's at stake for you and for Europe. My name is Maeve McMahon. Thanks for joining us. Coming up this week, to enlarge or not to enlarge? That is the question. EU leaders met with their counterparts from the Western Balkans in Tirana this week to discuss their prospects of EU membership. It was the first time such a summit was held in an aspiring EU country. But with enlargement fatigue around the table for a while, these countries have been left outside in the cold. So we're asking what should happen next, if they can really join one day, or if the EU is already too big, too cumbersome. And EU-US catfight, we take a look at how Uncle Sam has put lawmakers here in Brussels in a sweat. Since introducing the Inflation Reduction Act, which, according to Ursula von der Leyen, is the US's equivalent of the EU Green Deal, European companies, especially car makers, could find themselves in big trouble and unable to compete. We ask what all this means, what it could mean for jobs here in Europe and for Brussels' DC ties. To talk about all these topics and more, I'm joined here in our studio by Thomas Weitz, a Green MEP and farmer from Austria. Good afternoon. You're following as well the Western Balkans for many years, so we're delighted to have you here. We're also joined by Georg Rikelis, Associate Director of the European Policy Centre. You come from Norway. Great to have you.
Good afternoon.
And also Tinatine Achvediani, a Research Fellow at the Centre of European Policy Studies, and you come from Georgia.
Indeed I do. Thanks
Welcome.
for having me.
Great to have you all here. And before I hear your thoughts, let's just take a look at the long queue of countries waiting to join the European Union.
European Union enlargement, a long and drawn-out process often requiring years of change and legislative work. The last country to join was Croatia in 2013. Before that, Bulgaria and Romania in 2007. Since then, the process has slowed, with no new members joining in nearly a decade. But that doesn't mean there's no one waiting in the wings. Albania and Serbia both successfully applied for EU candidate status over 10 years ago now, meaning they're in negotiations with Brussels to determine their ability to apply EU laws and any possible transition period towards joining. Others, like Ukraine and Moldova, only recently became candidates following the Russian invasion. And Georgia, Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina all aspire to be in this position, but so far Brussels hasn't opened the door. For Turkey, a candidate country since 1999, there's very little hope of it joining the bloc anytime soon. But when it comes to the four Western Balkan countries, pressure is mounting after years of waiting. EU countries will now be asking themselves to enlarge or not to enlarge. That is the question.
So, that is the question, Thomas Weitz. You have, of course, been following this topic for many years. What would you say?
Indeed, I have been following for many years. Well, first of all, we have to see that there's a lot of relations between European Union and the region already. There's substantial money flows going into the region, support from European Union. We have been helping out in the COVID crisis. We have been helping out on cyber attacks just recently that occurred from mainly Russian side. So there's a lot of ties. There's economic ties. There's cultural ties. A lot of citizens of these countries are working in European Union. So,
but to answer that question, to enlarge or not to enlarge, or is it too simple to try and answer it just like
that?
We
can't answer it for all four countries. Like for Serbia, we are not totally sure whether they actually want to become a member of European Union, while, as an example, Montenegro is still the front runner, and there we see, real chances for a quick access to the European Union. Albania has formally just started negotiations, and North Macedonia is still a bit blocked by Bulgaria. So we have to see that all of these four countries have a bit different preconditions.
Okay, let's get the perspective from Tinatine.
Sure, I think the question is really political and also procedural, because there are two things here, right? So if the EU wants to have security, now we see with the new momentum with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, and if the EU wants to be a geopolitical player in the region, then EU should enlarge, and this is very much a political decision. However, this, all we can really have as an experience following the processes over the past decades, I would say, it's a very long and, burdensome process. It has procedures, it's a merit-based process, and it's very, very difficult always, to judge, are these countries ready to access the European Union? But also the question we should be asking today, what you're asking, is the European Union ready to have the new members? And I would say in a changed geopolitical situation, the EU should be definitely ready to enlarge to this region.
Okay, a very long and cumbersome process. That is, of course, the Copenhagen criteria. We'll come to that a little bit later. But Georg, I'd like to hear your perspective.
Well, I think there's nothing worse than promises broken. But I think very much in an accession process, enlargement process, promises go both ways. And of course, there was a big fallout in 2019 when France, the Netherlands, Denmark put down their foot and blocked the progress of discussions of the accession bid of Albania and North Macedonia. But since then, in 2020, there was a new process, a new methodology that has been put in place, which is very much about creating credible, predictable and clear incentives during this whole process. I very much agree with the emphasis that this is a process. There are benchmarks. It's clear that this is something that requires something from all parties. And I very much agree today when you see the stance that Serbia or the Serbian government takes on the Russia's invasion on Ukraine, on sanctions. I don't think it's at all clear that it's the Union that is leaving Serbia out in the cold, perhaps quite the contrary.
Well, as Tinatine said there, it's of course very political, and the war in Ukraine, of course, was a major game changer. And we heard this week, speaking in Tirana at the summit, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she had a clear call to action, perhaps, for EU member states, and she made her views very clear. Take a listen.
Russia is trying to gain influence. China is trying to gain influence. We are the biggest investor, the closest partner, and that is why the discussion is precisely about this point. You have to decide which side you are on. On the side of democracy, it is the European Union, your friends and partner.
Thomas Waits, your reaction there to Ursula von der Leyen? I guess it's not that simple.
Well, first of all, that counts mainly for Serbia, and it's not that we expect influence. There is massive influence from Russia and China, also on other countries, but not to that extent. North Macedonia, Albania and Montenegro are in full alignment with European foreign policy, and we have to acknowledge that. Also being part of NATO and carrying with us the whole burden also of sanctions in their economies. So they stand with us already. And the geopolitical argument is giving additional speed now to the negotiations. And indeed, when we allowed Romania and Bulgaria in, these countries were not fully fit for the European Union back then. And we took a decision to allow them in, also driven by geopolitical and geostrategical reasons. And same counts now for the Western Balkans. But one condition has to be met, and this is the rule of law condition. So we need a functional juridical system that works. It does not need to have solved every problem, but it needs to be capable to solve the problems of the country. And there we still have the countries lacking behind. Well, Albania did substantial reforms. Also, North Macedonia is on a good path. In Montenegro, in the moment, everything's blocked. You have a country with a constitution without a functional constitutional court. And this is a no-go. So the rule of law conditionalities, they have to be met no matter what geostrategical conditions we have.
Okay, you mentioned the wave of enlargement there in 2004, known here as the Big Bang. Was that a mistake? Was it too quick, perhaps, Tina?
No, I would say that was not a too fast. In a way, you should have had in place the mechanisms, to follow up and to also track the rule of law backsliding, even in the member states. And that's what the European Union is realizing right now, and it's also in the crafting. And indeed, this should be taken into account when thinking about the new enlargement and the new members accepting into the Union. So, and I would say there should not be the compromise made any of the three Copenhagen criteria, which is economic, administrative, and indeed the EU fundamentals political criteria, which so far proved to be the most difficult and challenging anyone who's been on the path. And this is also the call for the European Union to have some, more flexible instruments, more flexible policy that doesn't block the whole process, but it gives it a speed when it is needed and when some countries actually make the progress. Because what we've seen with the Western Balkans, the block, was locked when some countries made progress, when some countries did backsliding, there was not a fair treatment to them. And here we need the revisions, I think, more and wider than the revisions that we saw in 2020.
Reaction from you, Georg, on that?
Well, I think it's very correct to say that there needs to be incentives in this. I think part of, or perhaps the most important incentives one can provide is economic development, tangible benefits to citizens. I think the summit, the Western Balkan summits that took place this week turned out to be quite a positive one, perhaps contrary to previous ones. First of all, it was symbolic that it took place for the first time in one of the Western Balkans countries. But also there was a lot on the table, the 30 billion for infrastructure investments, roaming charges, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a technical aspect to it. There's obviously rule of law questions that are absolutely crucial. There are economic dimensions that are very important to keep this process on track. But then, of course, there's also the politics to this, and I think it's very important now in this new methodology that one does not sort of brush the political problems under the carpet. Some of these political problems that are there have been issues around language or religion for centuries and centuries. And
they can't be brushed under the table.
They can't be brushed under the table.
And you mentioned, Georg, of course, that summit taking place this week in Tirana. Well, during the press conference, we could see a lot of frustration among one Albanian journalist. She asked the Commission President whether her country would have to be invaded in order to get EU membership. And actually, we have had Euronews reporters on the streets of Tirana in Albania this week asking locals there if they think that they want to join the European Union. We also had a reporter here in Brussels asking if the EU should let new countries in. We can take a listen.
It should have happened long ago, but do they still want us? The others know the benefits, but we're already moving freely. The rest is about the economy. We should integrate further so that our economic level is alike. Education and state organisations should also be alike. We should become like the European Union countries.
Of course, where else to go? China? If we don't govern ourselves, no one else will. 500 years we've been up and down.
We hope so. If they accept us, good. Being called European is enough benefit.
If it's beneficial to Europe, then yes. If they're going to contribute something to Europe, then I don't see any reason why not.
No, I think those countries are a little bit poorer and need more assistance and would end up taking more resources than they're bringing in.
Yes, I think Europe should enlarge to the Western Balkans. The Balkans have always been known as a trouble spot, and I think unification with other countries that are neighbors would perhaps make the entire area more stable, and that would be good for the people. No.
No. Eastern countries generally have a different mentality than ours. We don't have anything in common, so if they want to join the Union, they should adapt to us, not the other way around.
Well, one lady there saying that Eastern countries have a different mentality to us. Tina Teen, what would you say to that?
No, first of all, I would say that this is very insightful. I think the talking to the citizens really teaches us a lot. And I think that comment has like two-sided story. One, I don't think they necessarily are aware of the sentiments if Albania and Tirana, for instance, that people are so pro-European and they don't really feel themselves being not European, right? And that's the thing. So this is just the other side of the story. And the other one is obviously, there is a very different background and history that Eastern Europe has and had. Western Balkans is different. Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova are different because they share the Soviet background. So obviously there are differences, but that's what the Union is for, right? This is united in diversity. And I think here the very good guidelines are really outlined in the treaty, which says very clearly any state, any European state that aspires to be, to support the European values, then should be invited to join the European Union. I think these countries, with their efforts, endeavors, with already a lot of reforms, some of them, most of them undertook, show that. And indeed, there will be always some mentality differences as it is in the Northern Europe or the Southern Europe. This is not new to Europe. This is what the Europe stands for.
Thomas Weitz, what's your reaction to that clip? Interesting what the gentleman then said there about being European. That's just enough, getting that label.
Yeah, I mean, if you know the country, Albania, I mean, they have been ruled by Ottoman Empire for decades, but then also the Italians, they have had foreign rulers, and so this call for self-determination is very strong in Albania, and this is connected with a sentiment of willingness to take place on the table of European nations, so to actually share the burden, and there's a very strong push towards European Union. And to the last lady, I would say, well, travel a bit to Eastern Europe. I don't see the big differences as she describes them, even though there may be some parts of history that we do not share. But sorry, I mean, Portugal and Spain were ruled by fascist dictators until the 70s. Yeah, so we have huge diversity within European Union already, and it makes us stronger rather than puts us apart.
Call there to people to travel if, of course, they can and they can afford it. Another point we heard in that clip as well was we can't afford these poor countries. Perhaps, Georg, does she not have a point? I mean, Europe is facing multiple crises now. We're heading towards a recession this winter.
Well, first of all, the question you asked to start with was to enlarge or not to enlarge. And I think the message that has come very consistently out of European leaders on this question is that there is a full and unequivocal commitment to a European perspective. Then is this a question of what this will cost? Well, I think there's a common interest of peace and stability in Europe. We spoke about the geopolitical dimension with the Russian presence, the Chinese presence, presence of other foreign powers. So this is not just Europe's backyard. This is part of Europe, and we
but
have
that commitment, Georg. Just sorry to interrupt you there, but that commitment wasn't always there. And you might all remember when Jean-Claude Juncker, the gentleman from Luxembourg, was the president of the European Commission. He said there will be no further enlargement for 5 years. He sent a very clear message that enlargement was not a policy priority for the European Union.
But
But go ahead.
I was going to say, I think this is very much also about then realistic expectations. And I started by speaking about promises and promises not being broken. I think it's very important to be clear that this is a demanding process on both sides. And if you start the question by to enlarge or not to enlarge, the answer to enlargement is yes. But it also requires deepening of the European project, reforms at the EU level, just as it will require reforms in many of these countries.
So Jean-Claude Juncker perhaps was just being honest there, what the European Commission is not doing, because the tables have turned and the tone coming out of the European Commission has completely changed. And in fact, my colleague Shandor Ziros here from Euronews sat down last week with the Commissioner in charge of enlargement, that's Oliver Verheugen, and this is what he had to say about the former Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker.
This is a major political mistake that has been committed by the previous Commission. So basically, Europe has turned its back on the Western Balkans and its neighborhood. We have done everything to drag enlargement out of the ditch, to bring it back on the top political agenda, to focus not only on the institutional Brussels bubble focus, but to talk about the real issue. And the real issue is the real integration on the ground. So when can these countries catch up?
Oliver Verheugen there, the EU Commissioner responsible for enlargement. Quick reaction to that?
Yes, he diverges in his intensity of approach between different countries in the Western Balkans. But indeed, I mean, I think what he says is right. I mean, Jean-Claude Juncker's announcement of 5 years is long overdue. So where are we now? Yeah, and I sign up to Georg. I mean, the promises that we give should be kept, and the fact that we are not able to keep our promises is massively decreasing the support of European Union in the region. And so we should be really aware to give realistic perspectives.
And what about the promises made to Ukraine this year that they would be fast-tracked, given membership much quicker?
Well, this is also the promise that should be, there should be some grounds about it, right? Because the European Union is much dependent on its treaty and on the legal basis, and there is really never a mention on the legal basis of that. So there is a really a big discussion. What we already saw and witnessed, it is already unprecedented. The EU has never had that the questionnaires were sent so fast, they were received so fast, they were assessed so fast. This is already unprecedented, and I think this has both, symbolic value, that showing that if you're dying for the European values, news here, we stand with you, as many times quoted by the Ursula von der Leyen. And on the other hand, we are also seeing that EU can turn off its legal barriers, when it's really at the edge, when it's really a crisis. And we see that happening. And many experts, many in Brussels, would never really expect or think about it.
It's a fascinating discussion. I wish we had more time, and we have so much to cover in that area, but we will revisit it here on Brussels, my love. But that's all we have for you now. Do stay with us, though, because after the break, we'll be taking a look at what an EU-US trade war could look like. See you soon on Euronews and Euronews.com. Hello and welcome back to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon, where we're taking a look at some of the stories that got tongues wagging here in Brussels this week. One story that had us hooked of late is the tension between the European Union and the US since the US President Joe Biden announced his big plans to incentivise Americans to go green. The French President Emmanuel Macron did try to smooth things over last week on his big trip to DC, and Joe Biden, the American president, put a tweet out saying, "We clean up pretty good." And indeed, it's all smiles there on that photograph, as you can see. But really, behind the scenes, there is a lot going on. Did you follow this?
Yes, sure, we did. And I mean, this Inflation Reduction Act is much more than the name sounds like. It means bringing additional 13 million citizens, US citizens, into healthcare, as an example. It's the biggest investment into renewable energy and, let's say, an American version of the Green Deal. That's all super nice and super fine. The only concern that we have is the protectionist approach of Buy American and to limit the support of the state to buy American cars or American windmills, or at least American-produced cars and windmills, and this is pure protectionism. And I don't think US wants Europe to mirror these clauses and to have the same protectionist approach. Either we do it both or none of us. I mean, we're partners. We're partners also in these crises, and I think we should act as partners. And so that means we still need to have talks there how we solve this situation.
Well, what we understand behind that smiley photograph and tweet, Emmanuel Macron was speaking at a dinner party saying, quote, "This law will solve your problems, but it will make mine worse, Georg, because in fact this could be really negative for European companies." What exactly would it mean, and for jobs here?
Absolutely. But first of all, I want to agree with what Thomas says. This is the best climate news we've had this year. And we've had a COP, but the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, with the $370 billion of investment, is the best climate news we've had this year. But there's a flip side, and that is it is also designed as a hold-up on Europe's industry, on Europe's manufacturing base, in key future sectors, with the combination of these massive subsidies and local content requirements. So one understands very well why Biden does this. He needs to heal America. He needs to revive the Rust Belt. But the consequences is very likely going to be a Rust Belt for us at home in Europe. And so this creates a very difficult situation in the transatlantic relationship. I am not very hopeful that some of these provisions will be taken out because the IRA is already law. I don't think Biden will in any way go back to Congress. So we are going to be facing in Europe a very difficult situation where essentially when it comes, for instance, down to investment for key future sectors, a business leader has the choice whether he wants to spend 400 million in Europe or 150 million as the cost for the same plant in US when you count in the subsidies. So this is a really complicated situation.
Let me just bring in there, Tina, and get your take on this.
No, I think it's very, very interesting to see also what EU can potentially respond to, because we're in the middle of the war, which is very, very costly, particularly for the European Union. And I think it has also been made clear through the statements we've seen, particularly from the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Bruges a few days ago, that, you know, the European Union is not going to be dragged into the trade war, because this is simply not an option. Europe is struggling already with a lot of problems. There is still dependence on the gas, right? from the United States. So there is a lot going on, and it's really in a position to start a trade war. However, what she also had, put forward was, okay, let's revise our homework, what we need to do within the European Union. Let's be more strategic about the state aid. Let's be more united to get more funding, and let's work together with the United States. And I think this is a good plan. As already mentioned by George, I'm also not hopeful to see tweaks, as quoting Emmanuel Macron, because this may take weeks, months, if at all it happens, and if at all there are exemptions granted to the EU companies, that I'm not really very, very hopeful. But indeed, there are ways that EU and US can cooperate, because there is also a wider picture. There is also China in the picture, and indeed joining the efforts to counteract China's threats is definitely the only probably winning strategy in here for both EU and the US.
So Tina Dean reckons the EU has a good plan up its sleeve, and you're nodding your head. Well, the EU delegation did go to the United States this week for talks, but Thierry Breton, the EU commissioner in charge of industry, snubbed them, and he actually instead decided to speak to French television. And to French television he said a high-level task force has been set up between the White House and the European Commission. We have listed 9 problems. We've sent an injunction order with very specific points that we believe are contrary to the rules of the World Trade Organization. Either they will resolve them, and we hope they will, or we will have to go to the WTO, and we will have to then consider retaliatory measures. We will really go all the way. Thierry Breton saying they will really go all the way. Georg, just a very brief comment.
Well, first of all, I don't think we have a plan yet to answer this in Europe. We have to understand that the international environment now is based on power, not on rules, also on the economic front. And this is not something we have taken the measure of yet in Europe. So going to WTO, I don't think that is going to solve anything. It's going to take years. It's dysfunctional because there's a lack of nominations to the appellate body. So it's clear that what one will be needing are domestic measures, domestic response in Europe. Some say, okay, relax state aid rules. To me, that sounds also slightly like a false promise, because that essentially means that you tell those who have the possibility to give state aid that they can go on with it, but that really carries the risk also then of fracturing the single market, fracturing the EU in economic and political terms.
We're starting to run out of time there. I'm just going to bring in Thomas, just for those viewers watching at home and wondering what's at stake for them, just very briefly.
We're allies in regard to China, we're allies in regard to Russia, and we should deal with these problems as allies. I mean, we could also see other solutions. Let's talk about the gas price. I mean, US could do quite something there. We're paying the triple or even quadruple price for gas than US industry. So there would be ways to solve it between allies. So I would say negotiations.
Well, despite allies indeed, and despite the tensions and the uncomfortable conversations, the EU delegation were having a good time. We saw on the Instagram of Margrethe Vestager, the EU commissioner from Denmark in charge of digital, having a great time. She put a song amazing out on her Instagram and showed a lot of pictures of her and the EU delegation having fun. But that's, I'm afraid, all we have time for this conversation. We will come back to it. But stay with us here on Euronews and Euronews.com. Hello and welcome back to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon, where we're taking a look back at some European stories that caught our eye this week. So, question for my esteemed panel: who is the most powerful woman in the world? Tina Dean?
That's a difficult one. Let me quote, for me, maybe Ursula von der Leyen.
Mm-hmm. Thomas Weitz?
Well, I sign up to the same assessment. Clearly, she's the most powerful woman in the world.
Okay, and Georg?
Well, this is going to be then a Brussels bubble joke, but then I have to say Roberta Metsola.
Well, according to Forbes, it is in fact Germany's Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. Did you see that this week?
I think I've missed it, but it's very good news. I think I fully subscribe to it.
Yeah? Is she really that powerful, Thomas Weitz?
I hope so, yeah. I hope so. No, she is, definitely, yeah.
But even for you as a German, I know some of the German industry are not too pleased that she's the Commission president because they can't invite her over for dinner, dance and lobby.
Luckily, I'm Austrian, so I'm not biased.
Absolutely. And what about yourself, Georg? Is this a proper title for her?
I think it's a fitting title. She's wielding enormous power here in Brussels, then across Europe also. With that comes a lot of responsibility. She has a very presidential style of leadership, of management in the Commission. A lot of the decision fall on her and her closest circle. So that, of course, puts a lot of weight on her shoulders.
And is she known outside Brussels?
Sure. I mean, I'm definitely not from the same party that nominated her, but I must say she does a great job.
Hey, and did you know that another European lady was also in that Forbes ranking? French woman Christine Lagarde, the head of the European Central Bank. And number 7 was Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy.
No, I think that's an overestimation.
That's an overestimation, do you think?
Well, there is a lot of power in the European Council. So it's never the President of the Commission that decides by itself or by herself. So I think Giorgia Meloni has a role to play in the European Council, and of course she can choose to play that negatively by holding things up, or positively by pushing towards unity and common solutions. For the time being, that has more or less been the case.
Thoughts there?
No, I think I would like to still stress on the Ursula von der Leyen. For Giorgia Meloni, I think this is really time. There is momentum there, and all this, big news, and I think that's what also gathers the attention around this. But with Ursula von der Leyen, I think there is a good thing we should just remember when she started the job. As there was, I think, a meme somewhere I've seen it was on Twitter. She didn't really sign up for the pandemic. It was not a job description, or the Third World War potentially, right? The war at the European Union. So I think she's really doing that job very, very well, and I think she has a great visibility within the EU as well as beyond our borders.
Beyond our borders. And it seems that this week was the week of the rankings, because also Time came out with their favourites. Did you see who got Time Person of the Year, Thomas?
No, I didn't watch it, no.
Did you, Georg?
Zelensky.
Yeah, did you see that?
I think I've missed it too, but I would have guessed that, so.
And number 2 was the women of Iran. And Zelensky didn't just get that title on the front of the Times, he was also on the front of the New European. So yeah, he's making the headlines there too.
Yeah, he earns it, and he owes it. Yeah,
he does. He's certainly had a very testing year.
He's proven himself to be a fantastic leader and inspiration, not only for Ukraine and in Ukraine, but across the world, across the free world.
And last word with you.
I very much subscribe to Thomas and George. I think Zelensky is the hope that indeed we will not lose Ukraine. And I think from my friends, Ukrainian friends, many often say, Tina, this is not necessarily the guy we voted for. This is not his government we voted for, but we support him today.
And imagine when he does physically come to Brussels someday, he will get a hero's welcome and the red carpet will be rolled out for him. But I'm afraid that is all we have time for on this edition of Bruxelles Je t'aime. On the week that, by the way, the European Commission proposed a plan to ensure more parenthood rights for people on the move around Europe. We will come back to that story another week and what it means for rainbow families. But for now, thank you so much for watching us. Take care, and we'll see you soon on Euronews and Euronews.com.